My wife said she needed space on a Wednesday evening in late October, and she said it while standing at our kitchen counter with her back to me, sorting through the mail she'd already sorted twice. That's the detail I keep coming back to, the mail. She'd gone through the same stack of flyers and bills while I stood there in my coat, still holding my keys, and she said it to the counter instead of to me. "Joel, I think you should go stay at Alan's for a few nights. I need some space to think." And I have replayed that sentence probably 300 times since then, because I got everything about it wrong, every single thing. I'm 38 years old. I've been married to Heather for 9 years. We met when we were both 27, both still figuring out what we wanted, and I fell for her so fast it scared me. We got married in a small ceremony in Elora, Ontario, on a rainy Saturday in September, and I meant every word I said that day. I still do. But standing in my kitchen that October evening with my keys in my hand and my wife's back to me, I did the thing that men who think they understand their marriages always do. I catastrophized instantly. I thought, this is how it starts. I thought about what we'd said to each other that month, which hadn't been much. I thought about the distance I'd felt between us without ever asking her about it. I ran through in about 10 seconds every way a 9-year marriage can quietly begin to die. And then I said, because I am apparently a man who goes quietly when he should be asking questions, okay, if that's what you need. She nodded without turning around. I went upstairs and packed a bag, came back down. She was still at that counter, still not looking at me. I said, "I love you, Heather," and she said very quietly, "I know, drive safe," and I left. I drove north on the 400 to Barrie to stay at my brother Alan's place, and I spent that whole drive grieving something I couldn't name. By the time I pulled into his driveway, I had decided, without a single piece of evidence, that my marriage was in some kind of quiet free fall, that we'd been drifting and I hadn't noticed, and now she was putting distance between us in the gentlest way she could manage. I was so wrapped up in that story, my story, the wrong one, that I never once stopped to ask myself why she wouldn't turn and look at me when she said it. I found out why at 11:52 that night when my phone rang, and it was Pete from next door, and Pete's voice was not right. Pete is 61, a retired high school principal, not a man who rattles easily. He was rattling. He said, Joel, there are RCMP cruisers on the street. There's an ambulance. They're at your house, buddy. You need to come home." I don't remember most of that drive back. I remember the highway was empty. I remember going faster than I should have been. I remember turning onto our street and seeing blue and red lights strobing off the neighbor's white fence, and my stomach dropping out of my body entirely. 2 RCMP cruisers, a fire truck, an ambulance parked half up the curb, and yellow crime scene tape stretched across my front door. I got out of the car while the engine was still running, and a young officer stepped in front of me before I could reach the tape. She looked at my face and said carefully, "Sir, do you live here?" I said, "That's my house. My wife is in there." And she held up one hand and said, "Sir, your wife is okay. She is okay. I need you to breathe for a second because I have to tell you what happened in that house tonight, and it is not what you think." She was right. It was not what I thought. It was not what I thought in a way I still haven't fully absorbed 3 weeks later. Because what happened inside that house while I was lying on my brother's couch feeling sorry for myself was something I didn't have the framework to understand, because I'd spent 9 years deciding, quietly and without ever realizing I was doing it, that my wife was someone much smaller than she actually is. I need to back up, because you can't understand that night without understanding who Heather is, and I need to tell you who Heather is the right way, which means telling you what I'm ashamed of first. My wife has been a crisis counselor for 11 years. She works at a women's shelter in Hamilton called the Meridian House, and before that she spent 3 years doing outreach with a program that worked alongside the OPP on domestic violence cases. She has a master's degree in social work. She's completed specialized training in threat assessment through a program run in partnership with law enforcement. She has sat hundreds of times across from people in the worst moments of their lives, frightened women, children in crisis, and yes, angry men, volatile men, men who had hurt people and men who were about to, and she has read those rooms and those people with a precision I did not understand was a skill. That's who Heather is. Here is who I had turned her into in my head over 9 years, my wife who does the shelter work, the counseling thing. She's good with people, I used to say when anyone asked. Big heart, works at a shelter in Hamilton. Good with people. I compressed 11 years of training in some of the most dangerous human situations imaginable into good with people, because that phrase fit comfortably inside my picture of our life together, and the real version was harder to hold. I want to tell you about a moment from early in our relationship, because it shows exactly how that shrinking happens. We'd been dating about 8 months and were at a bar in downtown Hamilton when a man who'd had too much to drink started following Heather to the bar too close, saying things that made my skin crawl. And I froze. I genuinely did not know what to do. I stood there with my heart pounding and my mind completely blank. and Heather turned around calm as winter, looked the man directly in the eye and said something to him, quiet, flat, not loud at all, and he stopped. His whole posture changed. He looked away, muttered something, and went back to his table. It was over in 8 seconds. She came back and just picked up her drink. I made that story into a running joke for years. Don't mess with Heather, I'd say at dinner parties. She stared a drunk guy down at a bar once. You should have seen his face. People laughed. I laughed. I never once sat with what it actually was, which was a woman who had already, at 27, developed the kind of controlled presence under threat that most people never find at all. I made it a party story instead of asking her how she'd known exactly what to say and exactly how to say it. Because asking would have meant sitting with the fact that the person I was with had skills I didn't have and couldn't fully understand. The comfortable version was easier to live inside. That's the shrinking. It doesn't happen in one moment. It happens across hundreds of small choices to reach for the easier version of the person you're with. And then a dangerous man came into our life, and I found out exactly how badly I'd been underestimating the woman sleeping next to me. His name was Craig Dalton, and until 8 months ago he'd been a subcontractor for the construction firm I managed projects for. Craig ran a small drywall and insulation operation, had been working with us for about 4 years, and I'd always found him reliable enough, professional enough, normal enough. Then, going through the accounts on a job in Burlington, one of our site supervisors noticed the material costs didn't line up with what had actually been delivered. I pulled the invoices, and when I started looking carefully, the thread just kept coming. Invoices for materials never purchased. Workers billed to our project who'd never set foot on site. It was systematic, and it had been going on for at least 2 years. When we totaled it up, Craig had taken us for somewhere around $86,000. I did what you're supposed to do. I documented everything, reported it, and cooperated fully with the police. Craig was charged with fraud over $5,000 under the criminal code, and at the time I thought I'd handled it correctly. Firm but fair, an ugly situation properly resolved. What I failed to understand, because underestimating people was my whole problem that year, was what losing that contract and those charges would do to Craig's life. He lost the work, his bonding and insurance evaporated, his business folded, his marriage fell apart. He lost the house in Ancaster he'd been paying into for 8 years. And none of that in Craig's mind was the consequence of Craig stealing from us for 2 years. It was my fault. I had destroyed his life. I was the reason. The messages started arriving about 6 weeks after the charges were laid, emails first, then voicemails, slurred and ugly. A message passed through a former mutual contact that I was going to regret what I'd done. I filed reports with the OPP for each one. The officer I spoke to was sympathetic and thorough and said, "Let us know if anything escalates." Which I learned means we cannot act until he does something. And I told myself Craig was blowing off steam. Bitter man, everything fell apart at once, needed someone to blame. Men like that make noise, I told myself. They don't actually show up. I said this to Heather once, and she looked at me for a moment in a way I didn't quite know how to read and said, "Joel, that's not always how it goes." And I said something like, "Come on, babe, he's not going to do anything." And she let it go. She let it go because she'd already decided I wasn't ready to hear it. She told me this afterward in the quiet days that followed, when she finally explained what she'd been carrying alone, and every piece of it made me feel the full weight of how completely I'd missed who she was. Here is the first thing Heather teaches the women who come to her. Before coping strategies, before safety planning, before anything practical, she teaches them to take their own instincts seriously. She tells them that most people can feel when something is wrong, that tightening in the chest, the moment the hairs go up on the back of the neck, and that it is not paranoia, it is information. And she tells them that the most dangerous thing a person can do is talk themselves out of that information because acknowledging it feels inconvenient or frightening. She has spent 11 years helping frightened people stop doing exactly that. She has sat across from men who were about to hurt someone. She knows what that pattern looks like before it becomes action. It is not a gift. It is something she built deliberately over a decade. Craig, she told me afterward, had the pattern. She'd noticed a gray truck on our street in late September. A Dodge Ram she didn't recognize, parked at different spots but always within sight of our driveway. She noticed it twice, then 3 times, then 5. She noted the plate. She ran it through a contact from her OPP outreach years, someone she still talked to because the work she'd done with that program didn't vanish when the contract ended, and when Craig Dalton's name came back attached to that plate, she didn't panic. She got methodical. She tried to tell me. About 2 weeks before that October night, she said carefully, "Joel, I've seen that truck again, the one I mentioned. I ran the plate, it's Craig's." And I said, and I have thought about this moment every single day since. "Babe, Craig is not sitting on our street watching the house. It's a coincidence. You deal with a lot of heavy stuff at work, and you're wired to see threat everywhere. He's not that guy." I told the most situationally trained person I know that her professional read on a threatening situation was just occupational anxiety bleeding into our home life. She nodded. She told me later she'd already made her decision by then. Arguing with me wasn't going to change anything. The decision was this: if I wasn't going to take it seriously, and the police couldn't act on a parked truck and a behavioral pattern she couldn't prove to anyone in 30 seconds, then she was going to have to be ready to handle it herself when it came. And she was going to have to make sure I wasn't home when it did. Because she knew, the way you know something when your entire career is built on reading people in crisis, that if I was there, I would either freeze or try to be the one who handled it, and I would be wrong either way. I would be in the way of what she was trained to do. So Heather waited, and she watched that truck. And on a Wednesday evening in late October, while she was sorting the mail she'd already sorted, she looked out our kitchen window and saw Craig Dalton's gray truck parked 3 houses down, closer than before, engine off, dusk going dark. She told me she didn't think, she knew. And she sorted the mail one more time, and she kept her back to me because Heather cannot lie to my face. 9 years and she has never once managed it. If she'd turned around I would have seen it, the focus, the fear she was holding on a very tight leash, the love underneath all of it that was driving every single choice she was making. I would have seen it and I would have stayed. And if I'd stayed, I'd have gotten us both killed trying to do the thing she was already more capable of doing alone. So she looked at the counter and she said the hardest thing she has ever had to say to me, and I hurt in exactly the way she needed me to hurt, and I packed a bag and I said I love you to her back, and she said drive safe, and I left. She stood there and waited until she heard my car turn off the street. Then she got to work. The first thing she did was call the OPP non-emergency line. Not 911, not yet, there was no emergency yet, not on paper. She reported calmly that Craig Dalton, a man facing fraud charges who had made explicit threats against her husband, was surveilling their home. She gave them the plate, the truck description, the address, the time. She wanted a record created before anything happened. She wanted responding officers to already have context when context became the difference between a clean case and a chaotic one. That is not something fear does, that is something a trained mind does deliberately. Then she moved through the house the way she told me she'd mentally rehearsed it for weeks, running the same kind of scenario she helps women in crisis run about their own spaces. Where are the exits? Where would someone come in? Where do you want to be, and where do you absolutely do not want to be? She decided Craig would come through the back. Our side gate latch had been loose for a month. She'd mentioned it to me. I'd said I'd get to it. I hadn't gotten to it. She left it. She'd rather know exactly where he was entering than be surprised somewhere else. She left the front door unlocked for the officers she was already routing. Phone in her hand, 911 open, one button from connecting. Lights off through the back of the house. She positioned herself in the front hallway where she could see without being seen, with a clear line to the front door and nothing between her and it. And she breathed, slow and deliberate the way she teaches it, because she has told those women in that shelter 100 times, if fear gets the wheel, you lose everything you've built. You stay in your body and you breathe and you let the training be the thing in charge. At 11:34, Craig cut the latch on the back gate. She heard it. At 11:37, she heard the laundry window give. She pressed the button, connected the 911 call, set the phone face up on the hallway table live, a dispatcher already routing officers, everything from that moment forward on record. She told me later that she'd wanted police already moving before Craig knew she was there, because her goal was never to overpower him. Her goal was to still be standing when the cruisers arrived. She heard him moving through the kitchen in the dark, toward the stairs, toward the bedroom where he expected to find me. And then he saw her in the hallway. I asked her to tell me what happened in those minutes, and she told me simply, without any performance in it, because that's how she is about the work she does. She said she looked at him and she used his name. Just that, said clearly Craig, his name in a voice that said she wasn't surprised and she wasn't frightened. And he stopped. She told me later that's almost always the first move. You say their name. You make them a person instead of momentum. You interrupt the script they've been running in their head for weeks, because the script doesn't have a character in it who isn't already afraid of them. She said, I know why you're here. The police are already on their way. You have a few minutes to decide what the rest of your life looks like. He was holding something, a box cutter the officers found, and in his jacket pocket they found zip ties. He had come to my house with zip ties and a box cutter expecting to find me alone and asleep. She did not look at what he was holding. She kept her eyes on his face. That's what she tells the women at the shelter. The face tells you what's coming. Watch the face. And she kept talking, slowly, evenly, the way she has talked to people in the worst moments of their lives for 11 years, acknowledging his anger without feeding it, using his name repeatedly. Keeping her own voice from becoming the thing that pushed him further, she was buying time, that was the whole job. Hold the hallway. Keep him in the hallway. Don't let this become a physical confrontation, because a confrontation was what he'd spent weeks preparing for, and she had no intention of giving him the fight he'd scripted. The RCMP knocked at the front door she'd left unlocked at 11:43. Craig was still in the hallway. He hadn't crossed the distance between them. She had held him there with 11 years of training and nothing else. The officer who let me in that night found my wife sitting on our couch wrapped in someone's jacket, giving her statement to a sergeant, composed and precise, and she looked up when I came through the door and something in her face just opened with relief. Not relief that it was over, I think she'd known it was over when the door knocked, relief that I was there. I crossed the room and I got down on my knees in front of her and I put my arms around her and I couldn't make a sound for a long time. She held on to me and she said, quietly, so the sergeant beside her couldn't hear, I couldn't tell you. If I'd told you, you would have stayed. And if you'd stayed, I'd have been trying to protect you instead of handling it. I'm sorry I had to send you away like that. And that's when I understood what those words at the kitchen counter had actually been. Every syllable, drive safe. The back sheet kept turned to me. All of it. The responding sergeant pulled me aside before I left that night. 20 years on the job, and he said, and I want to pass this on because it came from someone who sees these outcomes for a living. Mr. Whitmore, I have to be straight with you. We deal with a lot of these situations. What your wife did tonight, the advance report to establish a record, the positioning, the 911 call connected before contact, and then holding that man in a nonviolent standoff until we arrived, that's not something most people can do when they're frightened. That takes a specific kind of mind and years of deliberate work. You should know what you married. A 20-year officer told me to understand who I was married to, and the painful thing is that he had to. Craig was charged that night, entering with intent, possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose, criminal harassment. The zip ties and the box cutter and the weeks of documented surveillance made his intentions very hard to argue against. The Live 911 recording made everything else impossible to dispute. Heather had built the case in the same hours she was holding him in the hallway. In the days after, she wasn't fine. I want to say that clearly for anyone who thinks that capability means not being affected. She had done something extraordinary, had spent years training for a moment she'd hoped would never come, and she was still shaken afterward in the way a person is shaken when real violence enters their real home. She didn't sleep easily. She'd startle at sounds she'd ignored for years. And for the first time in 9 years of marriage, she let me be the one who held her through the night without needing to be the steady one. I couldn't offer much. I can't de-escalate an armed man with a box cutter or hold someone in a hallway with 11 years of crisis work behind me. But I could be there, actually present for what she needed, and finally I was. We talked more in those weeks than we had in the previous 2 years combined. One night I finally said the thing I most needed to say, which was that I was sorry. Not for the situation with Craig, I'd handled that the right way. I was sorry for what I'd done to her over 9 years without realizing I was doing it, for turning her life's work into a shorthand, for hearing her try to warn me about a dangerous man and deciding her professional expertise was just occupational stress bleeding into our home. For making her feel, she told me, like the deepest parts of what she carried every day weren't worth my curiosity. She forgave me before I'd finished, because that's who she is, and then she said something I'll carry for the rest of my life. She said, "Joel, I didn't need you to think I was impressive. I needed you to think I was real. You'd turned me into the comfortable version of me, and a comfortable version doesn't get to warn you about a truck on our street because you've already decided she doesn't really see anything worth worrying about." A comfortable version, that was exactly it. I had taken a whole person, specific, trained, capable of things I couldn't fully imagine, and I had filed her under wife, good with people, big heart, and I had stopped being curious about the rest. I had stopped asking. And so she had quietly and without any grudge stopped showing me. About 6 weeks later, once things had settled, Heather asked if I wanted to come and observe one of her group sessions at the shelter. She'd never asked before. I'd never offered. I went. There were 11 women in that room, different ages, different stories, different points along whatever road had brought them there, and I watched my wife spend 2 hours doing something I don't have the right words for. Not talking at them, not running a script. Reading every person in that room in real time, knowing exactly when to push and when to hold back, knowing when a woman needed to say the hard thing out loud, knowing when someone was close to a wall she couldn't see coming. She held that room the way a very skilled person holds something both delicate and heavy, without it ever looking like effort. Afterward, a young woman, maybe 23, stopped Heather at the door and said something I couldn't hear, and Heather put a hand on her shoulder and said something back quiet, and the woman nodded slowly, like she'd been handed something she'd been needing for a long time. I sat in the back corner of that room and I thought about all the Wednesday evenings I'd spent on the couch watching television while Heather was doing that. All the time she'd come home and I'd asked, "How was it?" and she'd said, "Fine, long day," and I'd said, "Yeah," and looked back at the screen. All the times the most important work she did was happening in a room I'd never once tried to picture clearly. I drove us home that night and I didn't know how to start, so I just said, "I didn't know. I thought I knew what you did every day and I didn't know at all." She looked out the passenger window for a moment, then she said, "You stopped asking, so I stopped explaining. That happens. In a long enough relationship, you stop offering the deep parts of yourself to someone who isn't curious about them anymore. It's not a fight, you just quietly put them away. You stop offering the deep parts of yourself to someone who isn't curious anymore." I am still sitting with that sentence. I made her a promise that night, and I've kept it. I promised I'd get curious again, really curious, not politely curious. Not how was your day curious, but the kind of curious I was about her when we were 27 and everything she said felt like a door I needed to walk through. I promised I'd ask real questions and stay for the full answer. I promised that the next time she told me something didn't feel right, I would not make her expertise smaller than it was just because sitting with it made me uncomfortable. I almost lost her without ever having fully seen her. Not to Craig Dalton, though that was close enough. I'd been losing her the slow way for years, one comfortable assumption at a time, and I hadn't felt it going because comfortable things don't announce themselves. Craig's case is moving through the courts the way it should. Heather made sure of that, in the same way she did everything that night, carefully and without panic, building the record that would hold. It will hold. Our marriage is something different now. Better, I think, than it's been since those first years when everything about each other still felt like new information. We stay curious, that's really the whole of it. We stay curious about each other the way we were before we decided we already knew. So here's what I want to leave you with. Who is the person in your life that you've quietly filed away? The one you think you know so thoroughly that you stopped really looking? Because I promise you, and I am more certain of this than I've been of most things, there are whole rooms inside that person that you have never walked into. Whole skills, whole depths, whole versions of them moving through the world every day inside a life you share, and you are not seeing them because at some point you decided you already had the full picture. Heather stood at our kitchen counter with her back to me and sent me away to keep me alive, and I spent the drive up the 400 grieving a marriage that was in absolutely no danger of ending. That is who I had become. A man so convinced he understood his wife that he could not tell the difference between her pushing him out and her stepping in front of something to protect him. Don't wait for the thing that makes you look. Go home tonight and ask a real question, not how was your day, something real, something you've been meaning to ask for 2 years and kept setting aside because you thought you already knew the shape of the answer. You don't know the shape of it. And the whole person is still in there, exactly where you left them, waiting for you to remember to be curious. Heather is in the kitchen right now. I can hear her. In a few minutes I'm going to go in there and ask her something real, and she's going to tell me something true. That's the whole promise, and it's enough.